Good morning, everyone. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Stryker Cultural Center. Welcome to our 7th and final spring session of Women on the Move, although it really doesn't feel much like spring out today. Today's author, Jennifer Rosner, wrote this fabulous book called Once We Were Home, and today is her actual publication day, which is a very exciting day for her and an exciting day for us. Jennifer is a finalist for 2 National Jewish Book Awards for her book, The Yellow Bird Sings, and the memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard, and a really adorable picture book called The Mitten Strings, which was a Sidney Taylor Book Award notable. We are very, very happy that Jordana Horn is here to moderate the conversation. Jordana is a journalist and a podcast host. It is now my great pleasure. Oh, of course, we have to say, although everyone probably knows, write your questions in the chat feature of Zoom. We'll get to as many as we can. My pleasure now to welcome Jennifer and Jordana.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, and happy Publication Day, Jennifer Rosner. I am so happy that we're going to be celebrating with you. Jennifer's new book, Once We Were Home, is a fictional story, and it's based on real-life accounts of some of the less told stories of the Holocaust. Specifically, this novel deals with Jews who were saved for various reasons by non-Jews and what became of their lives after they survived. It's very hard, by the way, to give a very tiny synopsis of this far-reaching novel. It focuses on a few main characters. There's Roger, a Jewish child whose parents send him to a Christian who hides him in a convent, a monastery, and in Christianity itself. Anna and Oscar, who for the purposes of this summary are 2 siblings whose Jewish mother hides them with a Polish non-Jewish couple from whom they are taken non-consensually after the war to be brought as Jews to the newly formed state of Israel. And Renata, a British archaeologist working in Israel, whose own past she has to excavate along with the past of history. So, Jennifer, welcome and thank you so much for spending this somewhat snowy and perilous publication day with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a big snowstorm where I live in Massachusetts.
So everybody on the Zoom, please keep your fingers crossed for Jennifer's power. I know I will. So let's start with the big picture. I'd like to talk about your fiction, whether this or, as Marjorie alluded to, your past novel, The Yellow Bird Sings, is very much rooted in stories of past generations. So whether we're talking about the shtetl or in this one, the world as it shifts from the Holocaust to the birth of the state of Israel. Can you talk a little bit about why this is your choice of setting and topic and the personal resonance that these stories have for you?
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's interesting because I think that my writing life has been a one thing leads to another type of pathway. And so I was a philosophy professor before I became a writer, and I had never done any kind of creative writing at all. And when we had children, our daughters were both born deaf, and it was the first time I ever took out a journal and just started writing stuff. And what's interesting is I was writing about, my responses to this news, to the kind of pathways of exploration that we needed to do for communication with our children, et cetera. And even then, in that time, I started looking back in my history and found that there were these great aunts who lived in this little shtetl in Austria who were both deaf and who, I kind of learned from interviewing a lot of family members, one little detail that they, at night when it would be dark, they would tie a string from their wrist to their baby so they would feel a tug. And this kind of, going back in history and learning and finding models for, in this case, mothering, for connecting, for listening, et cetera. And then I was at a book talk for that memoir, and that I ended up writing, called If a Tree Falls. And a woman, I was saying how we were encouraging our children to vocalize, and we were really happy when they made any sound. And this woman in the audience explained her own childhood experience of having to stay completely silent in a barn during World War II with her mom. And I couldn't stop thinking about that woman who, was made to stay silent, especially while we were trying to get our children. And I don't know, then I ended up interviewing someone for that book, for The Yellow Bird Sings, who talked to me about what happened post-war, or how she was an operative for redeeming Jewish children after the war. So in some sense, it had to do with happenstance that I was like led from one thing to another. But I also think that there is obviously a very deep resonance with this moment in history as a Jew, and as someone whose family name is all over these memorials all over the world. Wherever we go to see a Holocaust memorial, there's Rosner, along with all these other names. And I think it just hits a very deep chord personally. And at first, I had been really ensconced in the notion of what it is to be hidden. And I think that in some ways that resonated with what I think it might have been to be deaf in the 1800s. What happened after those children were hidden when the war ended is if they didn't have parents, that was kind of the next question after The Yellow Bird Sings was, what really happened to those children who were in those settings. Maybe some of them stayed in those settings and were raised by their, what you call their rescue family. And then others maybe left. But there was a whole set of stories that I had no idea about until I started researching. And that's really what, drove the Once We Were Home novel.
Yes, I want to start talking about this remarkable and complex novel and how this particular idea took shape. You alluded to, and if you could elaborate more, you talk in the author's note about interviewing a woman who worked as an operative for the redemption, and I say that in air quotes, of Jewish children, and how that led to this story. So if you could just talk about that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Yes, I was lucky enough to meet this woman who shared her history with me, who, after the war, she came back to her native Poland. 3% of Jewish children had survived. Most of them were in Christian settings, hidden with false identities, right? And after all this annihilation, there was, almost a moral imperative, I think, to try to reclaim every last Jewish person one could and try to repopulate this Jewry. But I also think that people saw Poland as a graveyard of Jews and that it felt actually unsafe to leave children behind. So there were maybe two kinds of moral imperatives. One was something for the collective, like to try to recreate, the Jewry that had been lost. And another was on the level of the individual children, that maybe it wasn't really safe there. Anti-Semitism was rampant still, and maybe there were these righteous families here and there, but some of the children also were stowed in places that turned out that they were just being farm hands, or it wasn't ideal. So there were different cases, and that's one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in my novel is that there were all these different cases, and I read many different testimonies and archives, etc. So this one, woman I met, maybe she was really she was like the inspiration for me to begin this. And then I started reading the accounts of other operatives, and they had really different responses. Like some of them felt that, they were definitely in some ways, saving these particular children. And then some of them felt that in the case of some particular children, their bonds with that Christian family were really foundational, and that they had gone through the first rupture of losing their Jewish family, and then they had bonded with this new family, and that to take that particular child was to create a rupture that was quite painful and damaging. So I think there were a real lot of different cases, and I purposely put in different children with different ages, different memories.
Yes.
Even a sibling pair, if one's 7 and one's 3, when you get to your rescue home, your bonding process will be totally different. If you remember your past, if you remember your Jewish upbringing, if you remember your Jewish parents, that's one thing. And if you have no recollection and you're just in this new home and this is all you know, it's a totally different experience. So it was very important to me to show, how complicated it was and how, maybe muddled it was. And, when you mentioned redemption in air quotes, I wanted to say that I think that the vocabulary is very complicated for this time period. And maybe for talking about the Holocaust and any genocide, maybe we barely have a vocabulary, and writers are doing our best to try to, give voice and animate these stories. But, even among the operatives and among the organizations, the Coordinatia for the Redemption of Jewish Children, they did argue about, was it redemption? Was it was it, could you call it rescue? Was it ransoming? Was it retrieving? Like they didn't even know what to call it.
Right. And I think that you give a very nuanced, detailed, and very empathetic picture from all angles, because you do show how, yes, from the macro view, I'm thinking of the view of Earth as, a blue-green marble, right? That, yes, this is redemption with the goal of preserving as much Jewish culture and Jewish life as possible after the murder of millions during the Holocaust. So I have so many questions about it. I'm interested in, I know that the book is based on these real life accounts, including, as you alluded to earlier, those of Jewish organizations that after the war, they took these Jewish children, sometimes, let's be clear, sometimes secretly or forcibly, from the Christian homes and churches that had sheltered them, and then smuggled these children to Israel or reunited them with whatever remaining family there was, or both. I'm curious how these redeemers would find the children who were hidden, often when, let's say, the parents who had put them with these families didn't survive. How did the knowledge of where they were continue? And I also really wanted to know about your own personal feelings about this movement and how they changed over the course of your research.
Yeah, thank you. Right. And, the cases they were all different cases. And like you said, some of it was secret and forcible, and others were negotiated, and they were offering money, and the money was funded by many organizations, including U.S. money and Israeli money. There were various people trying to support this mission. And
right. In fact, not to jump in and to tell you what you already know, but for the purposes of our listeners, I'll say that in this one situation I'm thinking of, it actually begins saying like, oh, I heard that your cow was taken during the war. Like, we can get you a new cow. Oh, and we also need those kids.
Right. Yes. And so there were these different organizations. I mentioned Coordinatio, which took a various number of Zionist groups that were kind of involved in returning Jewish children. There were also more very religious ones, Committee of Religious Communities. And there's, this one guy who worked alone, Yeshayahu Drucker, I don't know if I said that correctly, but, who worked alone. He went in uniform. He, kind of had tried to come with a status. Sometimes he brought a policeman. He had strategies. And there were, I want to say it was somewhat dangerous work too for some people. They'd go into a tavern, they'd try to maybe buy drinks for people, try to loosen lips at night, ask about different children who might have come during the war, and who would show up in your village during the war, probably a Jewish child who needed to be hidden, et cetera. So even at their peril, these operatives were using their own false identities to try to get into villages and try to suss up, the information they could. And they were doing this dangerous work because they really believed that this was the best thing to do. And like, in terms of how they found out, that was one way, was just kind of going village to village. Mm-hmm. There were other ways, sometimes with lists, but, it was very dangerous. If you were hiding a child, you would not want to leave any, evidence of that. Right. So like when Irena Sendler helped, get children into, Christian settings, there were these stories of her putting, the Jewish name and the adoptive name in a jar in the garden and burying them in the earth. And later after the war, maybe someone would have a chance to figure out who they are because they have they only know their Christian name, and they would go back and try to find their Jewish family, et cetera. So there were these, and in fact, that also happened among, like, you'd hide parts of the name in 5 notebooks, but then they would have to be separated, and how do you get them back? I mean, there were all these puzzles to kind of try to preserve identity while hiding your identity, right? And so it's very complicated and very, very dangerous. And so, there was the Jewish community in Poland, and there might have been some ways in which there would be, ways of trying to find even at least what village a child might have been placed in. Sometimes it was guesswork. I think it had to do a lot of on the ground inquiring and watching, et cetera. So it was a slow process. And, there were different strategies too, like that guy Drucker apparently at one point, learned of a child who had been, hidden in this Christian setting, and he was trying to get her back. And he created a whole ruse. They printed up wedding invitations for some like supposed aunt, and they asked that the child could come to just, come to the wedding ceremony. They brought her to a dressmaker, and then out the back door took her, show her Polish, rescue moms like waiting in the waiting room while the girl's in the dressing room. And then the guy takes her out there. I mean, there were these strategies to try to get the children back. And, different strategies, and some were really above board, and I really want the child, and they say yes or no. And a lot of them really, some of the Polish people, they're very poor. They were housing and feeding people, and they took the money and gave the child up because they really, they needed the money. They were very poor and maybe very hungry, etc. And they had just been through a war. So, there were different iterations of what happened. It was a varied field. In fact, there's this incredible book. I'm going to show it to you. Yeah. There's a scholar in Israel, Emanu-El, who wrote Dividing Hearts, which really explores this issue. It's published by Yad Vashem. And there's another book, At the Mercy of Strangers, that talks about this part of history too, which is very, very helpful. And so, when you start looking, some of these historians really dug down and learned about these different cases and all that, the whole landscape of what went on at that time.
Right. And also how, we tend to sum things up in very, succinct ways. But once these children were found, and assuming that they were taken from the home, I mean, the next step was not, we're going to hop on a plane for the most part and go over. And you talk about in the story, particularly of Anna, do you pronounce it Anna?
Anna.
Okay, so Anna and Oscar, talking about how their trip is very circuitous through Bavaria. I mean, going to Germany from Poland, can't have been that enticing a prospect, and having to pretend that you're a part of another family and all of these, and then getting to Cyprus and being detained in Cyprus, and then to be placed into the context of a kibbutz where, it's another artificial family construct.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, for the people there were different kinds of beliefs, I think, about what this saving was, like to take the children back, even if you ended up putting them in a Jewish orphanage, was still better in some people's minds than letting them live in a Christian family and grow up Christian. Because, in some ways there was this feeling that you were honoring the last wishes of their dead parents to have descendants, to have Jewish descendants. It's hard to get into the mind of someone who had just gone through this kind of murder, horror, genocide, to try to think of leaving a child in the situation where there was so much danger and it was so scary. But it's also interesting to note that a lot of the children who were in those settings, I mean, there is some sense that some of them may have identified with some of the anti-Semitism that they were surrounded by. But I also think that some of them just felt it was really dangerous to be Jewish, because it was. Yeah. And so to be returned to Judaism felt terrifying.
Right.
Because they had found safety leaving it in that instance, and then to go back. So some of them had reactions to that. They heard people speaking Hebrew and they started shivering because it was very scary. And then for others, they remembered the Hebrew of their parents and the prayers they said on Friday night. And and for them, it was like a coming home. So again, it was I wanted to capture what I feel is a really blurry, muddled, and complex situation. And so you sort of see the emotional range of this part of history, which I feel is really not very well known.
And you did not just settle with one complex situation. You went into several complex situations. You also write about Roger, the Jewish boy who's placed in a Christian institution during the war. And then when his surviving Jewish relatives petitioned to reclaim him, then he's baptized and taken on the run in order to preserve his newly Christian soul. I mean, and is there historical basis for that happening for people? This sort of?
Yeah. I don't know if now is a good time. We can try to share my screen.
Let's try. Let's do it.
Let me see what I can do here. Okay.
We have the technology.
We do. Hang on, I'm
Sure.
having trouble going back. Oh, now can you see that? No, I haven't shared. Okay, let me go back and see where I can share my screen. Sorry. I'm gonna go back and get to my situation. Well, hang on. Okay. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, let me back up one photo if I can.
Sure.
Let me see if I can.
You've already far surpassed my technical abilities.
Okay, thank you. You're very kind. I just wanted to say, while we were talking about the operatives who were trying to reclaim Jewish children, that these are some photographs that from the Yad Vashem photo archive of children, with their chaperone boarding a train. And just to sort of give you a sense of that. And then this is a picture of the Finley brothers, Robert and Gerald Finley, who are the true case that I kind of grounded my trajectory of Roger, although Roger's a completely fictionalized character and it's not the same at all. But on the other hand, these two little boys were in a convent for safekeeping. And when their aunt petitioned for their reclamation to her family, the church baptized them and took them on this crazy run, hid them from authorities. They were clergy that were in jail because they were defying court orders. There were all these kinds of situations where they just refused to give them back. And it went up as high as like high levels of the papacy saying, we can't return these children to Judaism. They have to stay in the church, as they've been baptized, which happened after a relative came, right? So there were sometimes baptisms that were really, I think, intended for the safety. Like they wanted the children to be, kind of in the flow of the church. They didn't want any suspicion. They were doing certain things that were really like meant, but they were even secretly, some nuns saying, but remember your own faith, remember your own faith. I mean, there were these righteous people who were trying to do it that way. But then there were cases of people who were like, we need we're saving their Christian souls now, and they're not going back to the Jews. So there were cases like that. I would show the next photo maybe when we get into the next character. Should I move to it?
Well, let me ask you about, so Renata, we're talking about the Lebensborn program during the war, where Nazis the Nazis were extraordinarily busy doing various things in various directions, kidnapped. I think that the guesstimate is 200,000 Polish, Aryan-looking children, placing them in German homes.
Yeah, and I'll show this, and then I won't. After this, I won't share. Oops, what did I do wrong? Okay. There were these. I don't know if you can see the one with the eye chart because our pictures on Zoom might be blocking it, but yes, there were children, hundreds of thousands of children taken through this program. And the reason these cases are, I'm going to stop sharing. The reason these cases are together in my novel is that I was so interested in the ways in which adults move children around in accordance with some idea, some ideology, some religious or nationalist or philosophical or whatever moral, thought in their mind about where a child belongs.
Right.
And these, in this novel, which, when you see all these different cases together, it seems as if they won't cohere, but all of these different children have just been taken from a place of home or a place that they feel grounded in and move to a different place for some reason or other, according to some adult's view. So I think I just want to share something really personal about this, which is that, as I mentioned, I have two deaf children. And when my first daughter, Sophia, was born, and we were in the swirl of what's a very politically fractious situation when you're a hearing parent of a deaf child. There are people who feel that your child should be raised by the deaf community, which you're not part of, and be, ensconced in a signing program, which you're like struggling to get up to speed in. But basically I wrote a piece about how, in other cases, a parent births a child and that child inherits the language and culture of their their family, right? But in the case of deafness, there's sort of this big debate about where a child belongs. Should the child be raised by hearing parents? Should the child be in a deaf community, et cetera? And it was just kind of a startling and personal, it was startling for someone to say, your child shouldn't be raised by you. It should be raised by someone else. Yeah. And I think that the emotional heart of my story has to do with that idea. Like, no one asked, what are the bonding? How are you bonding? How is the intimacy level? How close are you? What makes a family, and what makes it that a child belongs with one, person or another? I mean, so is it because as Jews, the children should be taken back to be Jews? Or is it as a bonded person in this particular family at this moment, they should be with them? Or is it, that as a child raised in the church, it should just stay here because, we're going to save his soul? Or does it mean like he could be part of his family in Israel? I mean, these sort of things. So that's a lot of what the exploration is about, the nature of family. But, also there's a lot about a sense of identity and how a child develops identity and a sense of belonging.
Yes. It's a profoundly unsettling book, because a lot of it talking about identity and talking about really who people actually are, right? And what that means, who you are. And in many parts of the book, you as the author, you contemplate who people are and how and whether people change. I'm thinking of Roger at one point when he's in Israel in high school. He thinks, if you rebuild a ship over time, right? If you replace each plank as it decays with a new and stronger plank, then is it the same ship? And what if you take each of those discarded planks and you build a second ship? Would that be the original one? And then even earlier in France, that made me think of when he says, he tells someone, I don't have my original teeth or, my hair that I was born with. So maybe on a cellular level, I'm a different person. And so therefore, maybe I'm just not a Jew anymore. So I want you to talk about this idea, both as a writer and as a philosopher, about people's capacity for change and their longing for home, for a place where they can be the same and where they can be who they are.
Yeah. I mean, the issue of identity, was something I was really interested in as a philosopher, but in some sense, I became more interested in it when I became a parent and as I've grown in my writing life. But, even watching my own daughters where, they're deaf, but they have hearing technology. So they live in the hearing world, but when they take off their stuff, they're deaf, and they feel maybe that they're between worlds. And sometimes they feel like they're, too deaf for the hearing world, but not deaf enough for the deaf world, all these sort of things. So that's been something, that's been in my sphere for a long time. And I think that, questions of identity and belonging, maybe we all are always thinking about and working on in terms of our sense of community and sense of, where we fit. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's funny. I didn't start out thinking Roger was going to be a philosopher, but as he started asking these questions, I was like, wow, this is what he's going to be. And, can you be moved from here to there, to there, to there? Can you be in a Christian setting and then a Jewish setting? And then can you, what are you supposed to, what does a child take from, all that kind of exposure and, the ways in which other people are thinking of their identity as as so important. Like, it seemed most important to some people that they be Jewish or that they be Christian or that they be German or that they be, this or that particular thing. And then the child themselves is just trying to figure out who they are, and are any of those, they might be formative things, but there's so many more things. What are we, containing multitudes, right? So, and it is a deep human question to try to find out, sort of the sense of who one is. And I don't know if we ever really fully answer that, or we're always changing. I think that was the other thing I wanted to kind of highlight with Renata's story, was that there was sort of this constant evolution in some sense of who you are. And maybe that's through self-discovery and maybe, and self-knowledge as you gain it. But, there's a lot that we keep from ourselves, I think, and there's a lot of stuff we just don't know. But maybe, it's an ongoing challenge for everyone, I think.
Right. And through, not to belabor a metaphor, but through the strings that we connect, to one another with, whether it's love or, or a sibling bond that is either genetic or not. So another dimension in which you address this whole issue of identity is, as the characters' lives change, their nationalities and their religions, their names change too. And I, for one, as a reader, was very grateful that you tended to stick with one name because it's a very complex story. And I was curious how you made that executive decision to retain, one name for the duration of the book, even though, for example, Roger later in life becomes Rami in Israel. And so for the vast chronological majority of the book, he is Rami, but to us, he's Roger.
Yeah. I mean, I grappled with this also in The Yellowbird Sings, where someone, a character's name was changing several times. And, if you have a very singular timeline and maybe one character over a time, that's one thing for a reader. It's, even with The Yellowbird Sings, I only had 2 different characters, shifting time. But in this case, I have 4 characters and the timeline is moving. And I thought, this is a lot. I mean, I think it's a lot for the children themselves when their names change. But yes. It's very hard, and that has to do too with the thread of identity and how one keeps hold of one's sense of self through all this change. But when I gave them Hebrew names in particular, I just would be like, they're calling him Rami, but it's narrated from Roger's point of view, and it's Roger. And the same with Oscar and Anna. Even if he's Yossi, sometimes to some people you're like, okay, Oscar. And I even sometimes say he means Oscar. Just because it's just a lot. Yeah, a lot for a reader to go through. This is a more ambitious structure than I have ever launched before, in this novel. I had to keep track of those things for the reader's sanity. Yeah.
And how did you keep track of it? And I'm very interested in your author's note that you allude to plot twists that were, that your daughters had suggested. So this is a precarious situation that we're in because this being your publication day, I'm really trying to be much more deferential to spoilers, and so I'm trying to avoid that. So if you can't answer that question, I understand. We'll take it offline. But I am curious about if you had a Homeland kind of board on your wall with Will Strings, or how that worked out.
Yeah. Let me show you one thing. It's maybe unusual to jump out of my chair, but one sec. This is like just one panel of many, many panels that I had going on with different colors for characters and ideas.
Oh, wow.
But, I did finally have to board it because there were things going on. But I have to say, so I have, one of my daughters is just a really great editor. She reads, she's in college but she has a terrific sense of story and has made some suggestions. And my husband also made one very crucial plot. He planted this idea for a twist that I ended up adding in. So it takes a village, right? And lately, we've been, since the pandemic, it's like you walk and you walk and you walk, right?
Yeah.
Taking a lot of walks, right? And so we would have these like kind of conference writing walks sometimes, up and down the hills. And, and I got some family love there. And, so that was helpful. What's funny is my other daughter, who's a fabulous writer herself, just stays out of it, which I think is really interesting. Maybe that's what she wants us to do for her. Don't mention anything when you read my poem. Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's fun. Thinking about this kind of love and familial love, in each of the stories that you write about, and whether we're talking about Renata's mother on her deathbed. That's not a spoiler, everybody. That's really upfront and clear from the very beginning. Or Rogers or Anna and Oscar's. There are people in each story for whom there's a lot of love on the part of these children and the people who have undertaken raising them. And I'm particularly struck by how there's a lot of love for the Jewish children, for people who are taking an enormous risk and risking their own lives and taking them on. And is that something that you found in your research, or that you hope to find, or that you embellished in writing?
No, I did find that. I did. I know that there are a multitude of stories, and some are wonderful and some are not. But there are a lot of cases where you meet a person who has stayed in touch, in their into their late life, they're journeying back to try to visit the family that rescued them. They felt so much love and support and care, and stayed in touch. And yeah, I think that, they know they saved them, and that's one thing, but they also loved them in some cases, and I think every case is its own case. But I think that if you were to go into those cases of, the righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem, that there were many wonderful people who were trying to do the right thing amid terrible people and just absolute horror. So,
and that leads me right into my question, because you wrote, sometimes Roger can't help wondering what had motivated Brother Jacques. Was it religious conviction, or a commitment to the church's mission to keep Roger for its own? Was it a sense of moral obligation to save a child before himself? Was it love? And so I wanted to know about your own contemplation of the proverbial righteous Gentile, and how that changed for you over the course of writing this book.
Yeah. Well, one thing is too, that as a writer, I found that the more I explore or deepen a character, the more compassionate I become and more empathic to that character. I think that because if you make a character round, if you really dig in and deep, most people are, there are a lot of things, and you start understanding them more and more. And the more you understand someone, the more compassion you have for them, I think. It's easy to dismiss a wooden or a type or a flat thing. It's much harder to do that with a round thing that has all aspects, right? And so I think I try really hard to understand my characters deeply and gain the compassion. And I think that in some sense leads to the research that shows that, some of these people, were incredibly loving, and they were innovative, and they stretched their food, and they played games to keep the kids, and they told stories every night. And they were trying to just the way, in The Yellow Bird Sings, the mom is using every ounce of her innovation and creativity and love to help her child get through this hiding period in the barn. I feel like there were these, amid all their chores on the farm and all this other thing, there might be, at night, let me try to make, let's use the ration of sugar to make the cookies because this child just had a bad experience. Let's try to tell a story. Let's, those things. So I think that, that does get borne out in research, as does, sort of every other reaction that you might expect.
This is a little bit of maybe a controversial subject, and you can tread into it as much or as little as you want. Your fiction is extraordinarily historically deferential. You've talked about how deeply you've researched, and how it is fiction, but it is based on historical truths. And so I wanted to ask about whether you have concerns, not only for yourself, but in the macro sense, about writing fiction about the Holocaust, whether we're talking about like The Boy and Striped Pajamas, or, any number of things, as opposed to primary sources.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think it is really tricky. And I think that this kind of wide-ranging World War II fiction world where it just feels kind of like a gloss over a lot of things is pretty complicated. Like, I think it's great that people are being educated, especially about some heroic things that have happened, and some people who you may not know, did something, there's a lot of stories like that. I mean, I know that, Isaac Bashevis Singer, didn't even want to read fiction about the Holocaust. It was really upsetting. Actually, that's not true. I shouldn't have said Isaac Bashevis Singer. I think it was Elie Wiesel who said that. I think that it's really tricky, and I think that in a way, my sense of obligation to honor the facts that I can gather is really an imperative. It's burdensome as a writer because you really don't want to make errors. Yeah. And, it just feels like it feels very important to try to do it respectfully and correctly. And, one thing is when I worked with this historian, the one who wrote Dividing Hearts. She had done all this, primary research with the operatives who had moved the Jewish children. And I mean, she read my book. Someone translated it for her. She read it. We had multiple conversations. She talked to me about the route that Oscar and Anna would take, from, Lodz to, they would go to the place in Bavaria. They would go to the place in Marseille before they got on the boat. I mean, all these very specific details about even how it would happen, never mind, and even when, what season, and how by truck, so that it wasn't just, playing with a history that is really important and significant and real, and so I think it is tricky. And I think that on the other hand, when someone says we only are going to entertain nonfiction about the Holocaust in our speaking series or in our reading series or in whatever, I also think that it's possible that you will not touch as many people because fiction is coming in at an angle in some way. Maybe nonfiction comes in straight at you and fiction can come in at an angle. It can come in an angle emotionally. It can come in and kind of touch you in this other way. And I think that's really important. And I think that's actually really important for young readers. So I think fiction about the Holocaust is important and tricky.
Agreed. And I think you do it very, very well. I'm going to bring in some audience questions. Susan asks if you interviewed any adults that were hidden children.
I did. I interviewed many hidden children initially for the research I was doing for The Yellow Bird Sings. Mm-hmm. And they were I learned there were so many amazing details that I never really could have known, I think. I mean, even as many memoirs I had read and stuff, I think of the way in which one's in a deep and long conversation with a person, you start asking questions and one thing leads to another. And it was really an amazing experience and sort of full of the ingenuity and kind of the creativity that people used in order to get through that time period. And one other thing that I'd like to mention is that I was just struck so many times by the importance that people found in finding beauty wherever they could, and how that helped them survive. So that finding beauty could really be a key to survival, even when it's very small, like these tiny things, like the way the tree bark smelled, or, like little things like that can really help a person keep going when things are really dire.
Eleanor asks, and this is a story that Eleanor, I would recommend when you read the book, you will know just how big your question is. She asks, did the children want to be rescued?
Well, okay. So first of all, I think it's really important to say that there are two rescue moments, if rescue is the right word, right? So there's the time when, in the case of the Jewish children, they're being put in a home for their safety. And that family who takes them in is considered a rescue family. Okay. And that just feels very important because those people were risking their lives.
Yes.
As were people in the church, et cetera, so that's the first rescue. And it seems really important. It's also the first rupture. Yeah. Those children have lost their first family and are going into this home. And some of them were really unhappy and some of them found their way. And then the second, if you're calling that rescue, would be the, what people have called rescue or redemption or return or reclaim or where they were taking those Jewish children, trying to put them back into Judaism. And for some of those children, they found a lot of peace in coming back to Judaism, or found, that they were happy to leave, say, this Christian family if it wasn't ideal or whatever. And then for other of the kids, they were really quite bonded, and it was a psychological, it was very difficult and could be damaging to be taken from a family who you felt love for, to be, depending on maybe where you were going. But, in the case of where they were put into a children's home and then this other children's home, and then waited 10, months before they could get onto the boat. And, so it might have been a journey also to how you felt. Sometimes I found that eventually they were happy they were returned, and others continue to struggle. But I think that, we also work through our history over time and make it okay, right? Like whatever we end up doing, we try to kind of find the way in which it's the right thing that had happened to us. I think that, again, there's no single answer to this question, and it was different for different children.
Yes. Another question is why you chose to bring the stories together in Israel rather than in America, or perhaps in a more neutral location in Europe.
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm going to try to answer it without spoiling anything.
yes, sorry.
Yeah. I think the kind of first narrative reason was that children were being taken to Palestine, through organizations like Bricha. They were being moved. They were being moved to many spots maybe, but I think getting out of Europe was something people wanted to do after the war. And so a lot of kids were, a lot of people, displaced persons and refugees or whatever, they were trying to get to Palestine. So that's one thing. So for Oscar and Anna, there was a thrust to get children who were redeemed or reclaimed, returned, to get to Palestine. And, it's funny, in the case of the Finley brothers, who, Roger's loosely based on, he had aunts in New Zealand and those boys had aunts in New Zealand and in Israel. And actually the one in Israel's last name was Rosner, of all things. Anyway, Roger, in my story, I just have him going to that relative, the one in Israel, because now I've made this decision. If two are going to Israel, I'm going to try to get them all in Israel because their stories are going to converge. And then the archaeology dig, Israel's an amazing place to be digging. And it all kind of came together that way.
Okay. One person wants to know the name of the second book that you showed.
Oh, earlier. Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. It's called At the Mercy of Strangers by Nahum Bogner.
Okay, thank you. And Tamar wants to know what your other plans are for your book tour now that you're published.
Yeah, thanks. So tonight was my book launch in Massachusetts, and it was postponed because of snow. And then tomorrow I will be in Minnesota for this thing that's terrific called Literature Lovers Night Out. And I have a whole tour that's actually on my website, which maybe we can put into the chat, it's Jennifer-Rosner.com. So there's this dash for several reasons, because there's other Jennifer Rosners, but also it would have been Jennifer Rosner, whatever. So it's Jennifer-Rosner.com. And if you go to appearances, you'll see that I'm in person in a bunch of places and I'm online in some places. So it'll be terrific if you join me. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. I actually, on the topic of other books, I just want to also mention that there's this kind of unbelievable book too by Gita Sarani called The Healing Wound, which is about her experience as a UNRRA worker who she would go into Germanized family. There would be a child in a German family who she was trying to repatriate after the war back to their family in Poland or some such. And she writes really beautifully about the complications of that second rupture, of that move, and what it's like for the German families, what it's like for the children, et cetera. And again, it's like, this situation can be looked at from so many different angles. And in my novel, I'm really I think, I've stuck with sort of the point of view of the children, although I do also try to weave in the points of view of different adults, and they, to bring perspectives.
Yes.
But yeah, there's just no one thing going on here.
That's right. Lynn says that The Yellow Bird Sings was wonderful, and I look forward to reading once we were home. You are so sensitive to the emotional health of children and explore such interesting questions with humor and insight and historical context. This question of reclamation is such a complex question with lots of gray areas. Thank you for exploring these questions with depth and concern and dedication.
Thank you. That's
and Anna asks, where it says, my mom has always considered these children as Holocaust survivors who deserve to know what happened to their parents, their grandparents, and their people. They were hidden, but the intention was not to give them away. What I would give to know and find a relative who survived and didn't know their real identity. Love the book. And I guess a question that stems from that is, do you anticipate people once you're out and about on this tour contacting you? You have 23andMe out there. Has this led to many, we hear more often about the revelations of, I have this whole, sister, brother, whatever. But have you heard things from 23andMe or other similar services where people find whole Holocaust history?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't yet. But I wanted to just say that I think it's really also really true what Anna said, is that one of the fears of leaving a child in a Christian home is that they would never know, and that they wouldn't know their parents' history. They wouldn't know their own, they wouldn't know their heritage and all these things, which is, and that, when a lot of people gave their children into Christian settings, they thought it was just this temporary thing, they just thought it was, keep them safe for now and I'll be back. And then that's where, they couldn't come back, and it is just complex. And, and like I said at the top, I think that a lot of the operatives who did this work really felt that they were trying to honor the wishes of these parents to leave descendants. So, there was so much at play, and it's such a, this whole history is so fraught, right? And this aftermath history is equally, complex, I think.
Yes, and Patty says, is it just me, or do other people find this topic of identity and all of its peeling layers so profoundly moving? And you weren't asking me, Patty, but I'm going to say no, it's not just you. I think that these are the essential questions. And, you alluded to it before, but you are trained as a philosopher. And so do you find that this is, putting your philosophical training to work in a way that you didn't necessarily anticipate when you got your degrees?
Yes, it is. So the thing is that when I was working as a philosopher, I was working on the nature of self in a way that like me and 5 other people in the country cared about, that's how it is in this sort of, we were like, analytic academic philosophers, working on, for me, it was actually the topic of how one can be alienated so that you may want something, but you don't want to want it. Right. And, so which part of you is the sort of true self there, and how do you navigate the complexity within? So I've been working on this, in some ways, I've been working on this for so long, the ambiguities within, one's own desire set. And then also, it is interesting. I hadn't really thought so much of how it carried through, but it's so much nicer to apply this to something, first of all, that will be read by more than 5 people, hopefully, and
definitely,
and to kind of animate it in real life scenarios or fictional, but based on real life scenarios and how they really affect us. Because that's the other thing, is that, you know, when we had deaf children, that's when the philosophy part, the really like kind of abstract, esoteric, academic philosophy kind of faded for me, because I was like, you know, I've got some real stuff to deal with right now. And I just need to kind of set that aside. And I feel really lucky that I've been able to channel it into a writing life, which I find incredibly nourishing and, you know, it's a way to be creative, but also really intellectual and bring all these different issues, you know, to bear and kind of set a big complex thing and try to launch it into the air, which is what it is like today on my pub day. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that, yes, you are extraordinarily lucky, but I'll say that for myself and for everyone else on this Zoom, we feel that we're the lucky ones being able to share these worlds and these insights, and all of what you put on the page with you. So thank you so much. And for those of you who can get out of your houses to a bookstore today, and if you can't, we have the link right here in the chat, so you can get the book right here. It's a wonderful read, and thank you so much for giving us this book and your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to talk. Thank you so much.
And I'd like to thank both of you. Jordana, you're a fabulous moderator. Everybody on the chat comments that as well. And Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us. What a moving book and such an important book. And I hope everybody purchases it, but right through our side piece, our chat, it would be perfect. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's watched over these last 7 weeks. I mean, we ended with Jennifer Rosner, which was a treat, and we had Geraldine Brooks and Amy Bloom and Ann Leary and Allegra Goodman and Pam Jenoff and Anna Quinlan. And I don't know, that's 7 of the most fabulous women on the move I can think of. And of course, we had Zibby Owens with us, and we had Jordana Horn, and it's really terrific. So thank you all for watching with us, and we are lining up just terrific authors when we start up again. And thank you, everyone, for being with us. And thank you, Jennifer, and congrats on a big day today.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Record.